Welcome to this week's Politico podcast. I'm Hadas Gold here in the Politico newsroom with Isaac Dover, Brett Norman, and Josh Gerstein. This week, we've got some really interesting topics. We're going to be talking about Ebola, and now that we have the first confirmed case of Ebola in the United States. We're also going to be talking about the Secret Service and how they're failing lately. We're also going to be talking about Barack Obama goes back to Chicago and what that says about upcoming elections and where he stands in terms of his legacy. So let's start with Ebola. It seems to be on everybody's mind lately. We now have the confirmed case of somebody in Texas who was in Liberia. We also have just last night the case of an NBC News freelance photographer, freelance cameraman, has come down with Ebola as well and is being flown back to the United States. Brett, can you give us the latest update on what's happening in Texas as well? What does this mean nationally? You had a really interesting story about how this reflects on the CDC.
Yeah, so we've seen, they've obviously treated patients for Ebola here in the last couple of months, people who were infected overseas and then brought here. But the first domestically diagnosed case was this week, and that kicked off the full mobilization of the public health response. So we got a quarantine in place on 4 relatives of the infected patient. You've got CDC and public health folks tracking 100 people that he possibly had contact with while he had symptoms, and you've got people on the Hill raising questions about whether or not the CDC in particular and some of the disaster preparedness programs are getting funded like they ought to be.
So I'm wondering if this reflects somewhat on how not unified the healthcare system in the United States is. You know, every hospital can have their own procedures, and we saw that in the hospital in Texas, the electronic health records played a part in the information not being properly disseminated that this man had been in Liberia. I mean, does the United States have some kind of like nationwide records keeping way that they can share information between hospitals or have the same processes in place, or does the government have even the power to say, okay, every hospital now must follow this procedure?
They don't have any authority like that I know of, and the medical record system is just a notorious disaster nationwide. It's different in every place. The systems don't talk to each other very well. What the CDC did do when this became a concern is bringing people into the country. They blasted out guidelines saying, you know, you really do need to check the travel history. And if you've got somebody from one of these countries recently who has a fever, they need to be flagged for Ebola, possibly. So this domestic case has, I think you could assume, raised the awareness of that probably across the country, in a hurry. But there's no one way of doing things.
You also see here, look, Ebola is bad and a very terrible disease, obviously, and we could end up, or virus, I guess, and we could end up in a much different place on this than we are. But right now, it's one case. It's one case, and the idea that it would lead to a complete reconfiguration of the medical system in this country or the way that Congress funds any of these things is hard to believe, given that Congress has enough trouble passing things that would affect many more people than just one. If we start to see more people who are infected, if we see, obviously, anything even in the double digits on this, and I think it might change the way the response is. But right now, while there is a lot of hysteria going on, I think in certain quarters, especially certain quarters of like cable television, even as they're saying don't be hysterical,
Don't be hysterical.
Exactly.
Screaming it at
They're like, there's no cause for anybody to be upset or freaked out.
Except we're going to have a helicopter circling
right.
around the hospital.
But the reality is you see that the government is taking this in a very measured way, responding to it as a very potentially problematic but still one case situation. And that's why you haven't seen the president speak about this in any clear way.
Do you think he is going to say anything?
If the president does anything, it will immediately raise the stakes on this. And so if it turns out that 100 people are infected, that they're quarantining, then we'll see the president. if it seems like it's even a couple steps short of there, we'll see the president talk about it more. But if it's one case, I don't think we're likely to see the president talk about this. I don't think we're likely to see many other people in the government talk about it much more. I mean, it is the kind of thing that the CDC should do, and not many people in the world knew who Tom Frieden was before he gave his speech a couple days ago, and not many people are going to remember who he is next week.
And I know that the Obama administration at the beginning, when it first came in, was monkeying around with maybe reinstalling some regulations that the government had for how to quarantine people physically that might come in on flights from overseas. And then it got a lot of pushback, and then they just dumped it. And so I do wonder if at either the state, probably at the state level, given that the feds don't seem to have a lot of interest in like getting all over this, whether it raises more questions. Like there were questions about whether these people were leaving the quarantine or what, and that I think freaks people out even more than just the fact that the virus is here. If folks are like supposed to be quarantined and they like don't stay.
Yeah, I mean, the quarantine's a big step. It's like not something to do lightly, to tell people they have to be contained in their house. And in this particular case, they're in a house that's full of, I mean, the Ebola presumably soaked mattress and clothes this guy had on, and it's an ugly situation. They're trying to clean it up, but yeah, they are. I think they don't. That's pretty much a last step. I feel like they really need to do it is when they quarantine.
Yeah, and they are legally, I heard, not allowed to leave their
That's
apartment.
Right. There's an armed law enforcement person at the door. Yeah.
That's terrifying. Okay, moving on from Ebola, let's talk about how the Secret Service seems to be a mess lately. We saw Julia Pearson resign in one of what would have been the fastest scandal leading to resignations, I think, in DC history. It maybe took just a few weeks. Josh, what?
Certainly in the Obama administration.
Yeah, definitely. Josh, you had a story about what's going on there, and I mean, is this really a question of funding, that they don't have enough funding? Was it a question of the culture there?
I mean, I think the funding might have some small part to do with it, but that's not the real thing. I mean, that came up several times at the hearing just the day before Pearson resigned. You know, the Secret Service does a lot of different things, including counterfeiting and credit card fraud and so forth. If they're really so strapped that they like can't field the proper people to like go after the potential presidential assassins, it's just an absurd management failure. I mean, you know, obviously they could lay off on the credit card fraud for a few days. So I just can't believe that that's the real reason. And we all know that from these stories that there are whatever 5 layers of security at least that failed with respect to the guy that ran across the lawn and got into the White House residence. And then, you know, what money would have to do with the spokesperson telling people that he was apprehended at the front door or he was unarmed, when it turned out he was apprehended sort of at the back door, and, you know, after running through the building, and he actually was armed. That's not a money failure. That's some kind of internal failure at the service, and then not correcting the record on that for 10 days. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with money. I think you're seeing accumulation of management failures. You're also seeing it's a very insular culture. I mean, it's never or not since its outset had not had someone running it who didn't come up in the service and have spent dozens of years there. All the management is from within the service. So these are not people that are interested in rocking the boat or trying to figure out a new way to do things or really ripping problems out by the roots and trying to fix them. And I think that's one of the questions is, will the president install someone over this agency for the first time that comes from the FBI or the NYPD or something along those lines? I would think if I were the president, I'd be looking at someone that had managed a big police department like New York City or Los Angeles.
A Ray Kelly type, something
along those lines. Yeah, Bill Bratton or something that has law enforcement experience but hasn't spent their career in the Secret Service. It's actually hard to find people outside the Secret Service who have a lot of experience with particularly the dignitary protection aspect. It's a pretty sophisticated thing that the service does, and there are a couple other places in government people do it. At the State Department, there's a diplomatic security bureau, but beyond that, you're talking about like a handful of people that guard some of the other cabinet officials, and that's about it.
And the thing about it that's really struck me as these stories have come out more and more about the security failures is that it is clear that there are Secret Service agents who are talking now, who are like, and that is a problem, because I'm sure that there are, it's a problem for the Secret Service. I'm sure that there are incidents all the time that range from small to medium that we don't know about, and that they decide not to release what's going on. It seems like that's clear what happened with the shooting of the White House in 2011. The man with the criminal record who, with a gun, was in the elevator with President Obama. The only way that that story came out, it must be, is that someone who was in that elevator talked about it, right? Or was directly involved with it. Think about what that means, that we have now this the Secret Service, which is supposed to be as confidential as it can be, as they come, now has agents who are talking. And each one of those little stories now is another chip away at the service's credibility, at the procedures, at all these things that can continue this going for a long time, if that's where we're headed.
Just to put my transparency hat on for a second, though, you could also argue that the failure to do that in the past could have been part of the problem.
I think that's right.
Appear to have festered because they weren't publicly exposed. You know, they had this weird arrangement where almost all incidents involving the Secret Service were investigated only by the Secret Service when we talk about the insular culture, and not by DHS's Inspector General or some outside agency. And so probably some of those problems that weren't publicly reported before got addressed, and some of them got probably swept under the rug. I mean, I don't know about the 2011 incident with the shooting outside the White House. It sounds like some of the line level people knew that this was a shooting, and somebody overruled them and said it's a car backfiring or whatever. Now, has that been fixed? I don't know. I didn't get a convincing sense from Pearson when she testified that it had been fixed. And I think that's part of the reason she's gone, is because she didn't seem like she was convincing people that she understood the gravity of what had transpired.
I think my point is just, yes, perhaps that is what it is, but it's hard to believe that the incidents that we now know about will be the last incidents that we know about by the time this is over, that there will probably be more revelations, because the agents are seeing not only that there's obviously some frustration there that's causing them to talk, but they're seeing that it's causing some results, right? The director of the Secret Service is gone because of these revelations.
I mean, it also lends credence to what the administration has been saying, that leaks are getting like more and more common, I guess, right? I mean, more people are talking, and I think it's also just more people have seen in the last few years. I mean, leaks have always been a big deal for decades in Washington, but I think more people are seeing in the last few years that leaks can lead to action, like you were saying. It also seems as though one of the main reasons, it's just from someone reading the coverage, not actually reporting on it, one of the main reasons that Pearson was out was just the failure to inform the administrator, like the White House, the president's staff, about some of these lapses, especially the gun in the elevator incident, that they weren't even entirely aware of it.
Yeah, or the First Lady finding out that the shots have been fired on the Truman balcony because a housekeeper housekeeper found pieces of glass and concrete, and one of the ushers told her, right, not the Secret Service.
Right.
Like, those are the kinds of things that you might want to bring to the President and the First Lady.
Right.
And remember, Pearson was supposed to be someone that was going to clean house already. This incident, this scandal, if you want to call it, really didn't start in the last few weeks or months, but stretches all the way back at least to 2011 when we had the Cartagena, I think 2012, that when we had the president in Cartagena, Colombia, and the prostitution visit on the eve of the presidential thing, which became a situation that was like an international embarrassment, and the president had to apologize for. Pearson was supposed to bring in, a fresh look, a fresh face to deal with these things, and yet they seem to have continued. There have been at least a couple more lapses of similar sort of agents getting drunk on the eve of presidential visits, despite what happened in Cartagena that you would think was the biggest possible red flag. So that's part of the challenge whoever comes in to take over the service is going to have to deal with. How do they just stop these kinds of things from happening? I don't know that they can stop them from leaking out. They're just going to have to stop them from happening.
Right. And moving on to another aspect of the White House, you were in Chicago recently, Isaac, with the president. He was back home for maybe 24 hours,
Not
right?
even, about 20 hours. He landed Wednesday evening and was back out by Thursday afternoon.
Right, but he loves Chicago. I mean, he's still the favorite son there, right?
He is. Rahm Emanuel, who's of course now the mayor of Chicago, but was a congressman from Chicago before that, and in between was Obama's first chief of staff. I talked to him on Thursday when I was in town, and he said, I'm not getting the quote exactly right, but he said to me, the way that the Kennedys feel about, or that Massachusetts feels about the Kennedys is the way that Chicago feels about Obama. The love is just so much there still. And you can see it in the streets. I've traveled elsewhere with the president, even in friendly territory elsewhere around the country. It is not like the way that he's received in Chicago. They're just, usually there are people with signs protesting him in Chicago. Not even that, until he got to the Northwestern campus where he was on Thursday afternoon. And then there was a group of protesters there. But I can tell you that the number of people on the Northwestern campus who were just standing there cheering, taking photos, doing all that stuff of support was so much larger than the number of protesters. And I talked to folks around the president who said that this was an important trip for him, of just rejuvenating him is the word that was used. He's had a tough couple of months dealing with all the problems around the world. He's got a month ahead of him when he is planning to do what he can to help Democrats win some of the midterm campaigns, but in a very restricted set of locations to the places where Democrats and Obama are most popular, which are not that many places at this point. And they started him in Chicago. He got to go to a private dinner with his friends on Wednesday night. Then he went home, slept in his own bed. He got to play some cards, which he loves doing, back at the house. And then was at a fundraiser for the governor, Pat Quinn. Every place he went, it was, "You're home. We love you. We love you." And, that's important to anyone. That's important, I think, to Obama particularly, and especially at this moment in his presidency when a lot of people feel like the magic is gone, like the love is gone in most places.
Is he really? I mean, I was reading your piece, and it sounded like he is very damaged. Is his presidency and his image as damaged as people are saying?
I think the proof is in the fact that there are very few House races, Senate races, and even governor's races that are competitive that want the president to come and campaign.
What are his most recent approval numbers? Do you know?
They've been floating around the low 40s for a while. I don't think it's dipped below that. It's probably not going to go much in either direction unless something drastic happens until the end of the presidency at this point. And this is Barack Obama, who was the rock star. This is the guy who everybody just felt not only positive towards, but enthusiastic towards, beyond just his base. And when I say everybody, but like even to moderates, to Republicans who didn't really agree with him, there were good feelings towards him among a lot of Republicans. Not clearly, there were a lot of Republicans who were very opposed to him always, but he is in a very different place than he was when he was first running for president. And even where he was when he was running for re-election.
Okay, now we get to go to the most fun part of the podcast, other than me messing up Isaac's name 50 times in the beginning, to the shout-out round. So, guys, please shout out your favorite restaurant, something you did this past week, a sports team, whatever you would like. Josh, should we start with you?
I'm going to shout out a story written by a friend of mine named Julian Barnes, who works for the Wall Street Journal. And he did a very funny story. You would think it would be hard to find a funny story about ISIL or bombing Syria or Iraq. But he did one about the problems the military is having, naming the operation in that area of the world. They apparently had a tentative name of Operation Inherent Resolve, which was sent to the White House, and the White House rejected it. So the operation is for the time being unnamed. But anyway, it's a pretty funny story about the various silly names the military has given to the U.S. military has given to its exploits around the world, including one that was called Operation Blue Spoon and things like that. So it'll be amusing to see what they settle on for this particular mission. It's not going to be as inspiring as enduring freedom or
I would
infinite wisdom.
I would assume that they like don't want to name it because then that gives it more of like a this is an actual thing that we're doing and battling.
It might be a war. I mean, remember all the struggle the administration had right at the beginning for like, a few weeks ago, just trying to decide, was it a war, wasn't a war? John Kerry said one thing, the White House said another thing.
Kerry landed on you
Now,
can call it a war if you like,
You can
right?
call it a war if you want, or
Right.
it's the same kind of war.
we're in with Al-Qaeda. So if you think that's a war, it's a war. But if you don't, it isn't. And that's the kind of like message clarity that we're left with at this point.
Lovely. Okay. Brett, what's your shout out?
I'll give a shout out to the Medici on 57th, which is a restaurant where I waited tables on the south side of Chicago well before Obama was on the national stage. Probably
Where he used
on
to hang
him,
out,
Where
right?
he used to hang out. Probably on him without knowing it.
I'll go with the story as well. There's a piece up on BuzzFeed by Ruby Kramer about Martin O'Malley trying to appeal to LA and Hollywood donors who just happen to be the same people largely who were donating to Obama over Hillary Clinton in 2008 and donating to a woman named Wendy Gruhl who Bill Clinton endorsed, but nonetheless still lost the mayor's race to Eric Garcetti, the current mayor of L.A. It's an interesting look into how O'Malley, who I think most people in the country would be surprised to know that a man named Martin O'Malley exists or that he's running for president. They don't know anything about that. But to people who are paying attention closely to this, how O'Malley is trying sort of to put himself out there as a contender who might be a Hillary Clinton alternative. That is a hard thing to see how it would work, and it's a hard thing to do, but this is one of the ways in which they're trying to do it.
My shout out will be to a good friend of mine and avid tweeter at Politico's Logan Dobson, who's a pollster. It's his birthday today, and for his birthday, the Giants, his hometown team, are playing the Nats, and he is at the game, so I hope he has a very lovely time and isn't too sad later tonight when we all go out when the Giants lose. I'm Hadas Gold. Thanks for tuning into the Politico podcast with Josh Gerstein, Isaac Dover, and Brett Norman. You can find us online at SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, and Politico.com/podcast.